And we're recording. Well, greetings to all of our viewers, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation supported by the Society for the Study of Social Problems. My name is Ashley Stone, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Central Florida, and I will be co-facilitating this conversation with Brittany Miles. Brittany, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Miles. I'm a PhD student in sociology at the University of Cincinnati.
Thank you, Brittany. And so today we have the honor of speaking with professor, public historian, and author of Ida B. the Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells, Michelle Duster. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
No, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Great, thank you, thank you. So we're just going to dive right into the conversation. So we've read Ida B. the Queen. It is phenomenal. There was a lot that I think we knew going into the book, a lot that we didn't know, and it resonates with us as sociologists and Black women coming up through the academy. And so we want to start there with, looking at Ida B. Wells's work. From your perspective, what makes her work revolutionary and what makes it sociological?
Wow. Well, so my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was this journalist, a suffragist, a civil rights activist. She founded several organizations, including the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So the work that she did spanned multiple areas of life. And what I found to be the common thread of everything that she did was about fighting for first-class citizenship. Because she was born during the Civil War. She was born enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And so she really started life with no rights at all as property. And so to go from that, she had to fight for everything, right? As a woman and as an African American. And so, basically her life itself is revolutionary, to actually believe that she deserved first-class citizenship, and to believe that she had the right to vote, to have an influence and say in our democracy, to believe that she had the right to own a business, to become educated. I mean, almost everything about her attitude regarding life would be considered revolutionary, considering the fact that people who looked like her in every way were considered to not even really be fully human.
Thank you for that. I think that's, her life itself, and reading about her life and from a personal perspective, as well as the work that she did, there were so many firsts, right? And so much that she did so early in her life, writing, caring for her family, all these different areas of her life where she was just did a lot, right? That we can't even, I can't imagine doing a fraction of it, but she did so much in so early beginning that work. And so it really is inspiring, her life altogether. And so we want to now talk a little bit about, her work and the impact of it, so I know Brittany had some thoughts around that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm so inspired by this work, but it's very clear that none of that had to be easy. It couldn't have been, especially given how she was positioned in society. And so as she was doing all of this work that in some ways is filled with a lot of pain, in what ways was it validating? And for who was that true?
Right. So my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was a journalist. I mean, she started working in journalism as what I call, in today's world, we call it a side gig, while she was teaching full time. And she was doing it because it was for her, a creative outlet. It was a way for her to express herself and to like examine the world and critique the world. And she was very, very forthright and honest in the way that she evaluated the world. And so, so in a way, she stood out from even other journalists at that time who were not as brutally honest and forthright and direct. She also broke barriers when it came to not only her honesty, but the topics that she chose to write about. She defied gender stereotypes and sort of expectations based on gender, and wrote about, quote, hard news versus what the expectations were for women to write about women's issues, which were like, housekeeping and decorating and fashion and child rearing and sort of like home-based kind of things. And so when she, before her friends were murdered, the writing that she was doing was mostly focused on sort of social issues that were in her community. But after what was a turning point for her was that she had 3 friends who owned a successful grocery store, and they were lynched basically for being successful while Black. They rivaled a white-owned grocery store, and that owner decided he wanted to get rid of the competition. And so one thing led to another, and they were attacked. The Black grocery store owners were attacked, and they defended themselves, and then everything was turned around, and so they were the aggressors. And so that opened my great grandmother's eyes to how lynching was being used as a form of domestic terrorism in order to maintain a sort of racially based social and economic hierarchy. And so her work from that point forward was focused on educating the public of what the realities of lynching were, which was a form of oppression. And so, I mean, when it comes to validating, what she was doing was unmasking the truth about what was really going on regarding lynching, because the narrative that was being told at that time in order to justify lynching was the predominant narrative was that Black men were violating white women. And there was a criminalization of Blackness, of Black men being these, very violent, dangerous people that white women needed to be protected from. And so with my great grandmother's experience with her friends being lynched, that blew that narrative out of the water. It was like, no, this is what's really happening, is that the Black community is being targeted, Black leaders are being targeted and terrorized in order to influence people to not strive for certain things. And so what she was doing was validating the Black experience, the Black perspective of what was happening. Because in the mainstream media, it was not framed that way at all. Black people were being blamed for the violence, and it was being justified. And we even see that today. And so, that was one of the things that I'm hoping that comes from the book, Ida B. the Queen, is that people will see, that we just finished having a major trial, and we just every day it seems like we're hearing about Black people who are killed by police, innocent Black people who are killed by police, and we're seeing in real time how the victims are demonized and blamed for their own deaths. And so that was what was happening during my great grandmother's time.
Yeah, the relationship between then and now, and still seeing this pattern happen. Go ahead, Brittany. I'm sorry, but I appreciate you making that connection, right? Because here we are 100 years later, and this is still the same narrative that's being pushed. But go ahead, Brittany.
No, I appreciate it, because that's exactly what I was going to point out. I mean, the way you kind of volley back and forth between her work and her time and moments of the present. You talk about Bree Newsom climbing up that flagpole. You talk about, just so many cases and current events that really create a thread between and across time, where though her work was happening then, 100 years ago, it is so relevant and urgent today. And I think that it definitely speaks to the now as much as it speaks to the then as well. Ashley, I'm sure you want to know more about that, of course, and unpack kind of the implications of that for us.
Definitely. I think it's, in reading about Ida B. Wells's life, the work that she did, where she was not only writing about these issues, right? But actively, challenging them, right? As an African American woman. And so in looking at a lot of the sociological work from Patricia Hill Collins and other Black sociologists, right? Black women sociologists, they talk about the subjugation of Black women's knowledge, right? And so Patricia Hill Collins specifically talks about Black women's work being subjugated because it is pointing to these inequalities consistently, right? The work is not taken seriously because it's shedding light, on the social issues of the day. And so, your family has done so much work to ensure that Ida B. Wells's legacy is out there in many ways, from monuments to the books. So there's so much that's happening. And so, from where we sit, what work is required of folks? What work is required of us to continue to amplify her work? Because it is so relevant and so dynamic. Reading it 100 years later, it still feels like she wrote this yesterday, right? And so the work is very important. It's a profound contribution. And so while your family has done so much, what else do folks need to be doing to make sure that her work continues to get amplified and recognized for its dynamism, for its complexity, for everything that it brings? How do we do that?
Well, I think the main thing that comes to my mind is just education, working within the educational system, when it comes to curriculum, because one of the things that I've tried to do with Ida B. the Queen is to present my great grandmother in a multidimensional way, to fully humanize her as somebody who did have setbacks and disappointments, did doubt herself at times, did have financial struggles, did feel depressed and demoralized at times, because I think that I personally feel that there's a danger of sort of deifying people and to the point where they are not really relatable. And almost intimidating, and people feel like I can never be like that. That person did so many things, and what can I do that's even close to that? And I want people to feel that Ida is somebody that they can emulate or they can be inspired by and not intimidated by. And so I feel strongly that all of these historical figures, national leaders, thought leaders, people who are, who've made huge contributions to our country need to be learned about, but they need to be learned about in a way that humanizes them and sort of shows all of the multiple dimensions of who they were as people. Because I think that people can learn, when you talk about, children, can learn about themselves. And because especially when you're just saying maybe middle school to high school years, there's so much anguish, there's so much thinking about who you are and wanting to fit in with your friends and trying to define yourself separate from your parents. And I mean, those years of development are just full of that kind of questioning. And so I think that if information is presented in a way that incorporates the same type of doubt and growth that these people went through, then it makes it more accessible.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I think sometimes in learning about Ida B. Wells's life as a child, growing up on the South Side of Chicago, I was like, I could never do that. And that courage is so critical, right? And who she is. But in reading this book with the excerpts from her diary and just how she felt after certain events in her life, it's like, wow, okay, I have those moments as well as I'm on my journey. And so it really made the book resonate with me more and made her resonate with me more, as an African-American woman going through this process, right, of in the academy, right, and even things I experienced outside of the academy. So thank you for that. And we know, as the book has influenced so many people from so many backgrounds, we know that obviously Ida B. Wells has had an influence on you. And so, Brittany's gonna draw that out, but we want to also bring it back to, because you do a lot, Michelle. You out here, you do a lot, and you are doing so much. So yeah, Brittany.
Absolutely. I'm from Chicago too. I'm a North Sider from the projects up north, but I think about Ida B. Wells being a woman of the people, a woman who served people, real people and their real lives and all the messiness that came with it. And in telling those stories, and documenting these things and being in conversation and critiquing and doing this work openly in public forums, she served people throughout every facet and all the different spaces she was in. And I think when you talk about presenting her in these multidimensional ways, it's so validating because we are many things, and we show up in the world in so many different ways, and to be able to honor that, again, without, deifying them, absolutely. And so I think her doing work for people and being, people, family of the people, I think it matters so deeply how she inspired us and how we carry her with us. But I think you sit in a very unique position, obviously, as a relative. And so I then turn to you and ask, how has her work influenced you?
Right, Brittany, well, thank you for that question. I'm obviously, I grew up knowing who my great grandmother was. Ida B. Wells was my grandmother's mother, and I knew my grandmother very well. And so, I grew up knowing, the work that my great grandmother did. But my grandmother, I really, really appreciate looking back now on how my grandmother presented her mother to me, and how she sort of, I feel, was a grandmother. She was very focused on us. There were a total of 15 of us grandchildren, and she focused on us. And she was interested in what we were doing in school, and would come to our little school plays and concerts. She came to our graduations, and so she wasn't one of those people who was constantly like, well, let me tell you about my mother, and so then it's never about you. And so and she really was very adamant that I can say how she interacted with me, and I'm guessing it was pretty much the same with all of us. That she really was very encouraging of us to have our own identity and our own sense of accomplishment, and not put any pressure on us to live up to anybody else's accomplishments, or the things that they did career-wise, or I never felt any pressure to follow in anybody else's footsteps. And so when it comes to so I feel like I came to appreciate who my great grandmother was in my own time, in my own way. And as I've learned about her in more detail over the past 30 years, what has stood out to me that has particularly been very inspiring is the entrepreneurial aspect of her, which is very underrated. Most people talk about her as a journalist and as a suffragist, and she was, this major organizer, which all of that is true. But when I started thinking about it, I'm like, wait a minute, she actually co-owned a newspaper. And she was she had to be a masterful negotiator, because she was originally approached by these two gentlemen to be the editor of the Memphis Free Speech. But she, according to her autobiography, gave a counter offer that she would be the editor, with the understanding she would also buy into the paper equally. So she would have 1/3 ownership of the newspaper. And I just was like, of course I knew that. I knew that she wrote for the Memphis Free Speech. I knew she was owner, but I didn't really think about it that deeply. Like, wait a minute. She actually demanded, that she is an equal owner with because they approached her about being the editor. And then when she got run out of Memphis because of all of the things she was writing in the Memphis Free Speech after her friends were alleged, then she went up to New York City and connected with T. Thomas Fortune, who she already knew. And he gave her the opportunity to write for the New York Age. And from what I understand, he asked her for the subscription list for the Memphis Free Speech. And she agreed to give it to him under the condition that she had a quarter ownership of the New York Age. And so I'm like, wow, she was like, I'm not playing. You know, you want me to be part of your organization. Well, I want part of the actual ownership. And then the third thing that really struck me as far as how she really looked out for herself financially, which is not only about finance, it's about having control. And I think having part ownership in the outlet that she was writing for did give her a level of control over what she was able to write. Because I know from my own experience, and most people, you know, who are writers today, and for everybody who's written before knows that as a writer, you know, there are filters that go through, you know, as far as from whatever you write at first to what's actually gets published, right? But if you are the actual publisher, then that gives you another level of control of whatever does get published. And so the third thing that she did that really resonated with me, that I was like, wow, you know, I'm going to take notes on how to make sure to look out for myself and look for you know, ways to have control over my own destiny, was when she was asked to go to England, and I'm speaking to her in 1894. She was offered to have her travel and expenses paid, including food. But she was like, okay, but how am I supposed to live? Okay, you give me, I can get a free trip and I can get, you know, food, I can eat, but she would end up leaving this speaking tour empty-handed with no money. So she went to the publisher of the Daily Interocean newspaper and struck a deal with him that she would write a column during her travels throughout Britain, for the Daily Interocean, and it, you know, for her to be paid to do that. So she was one of the first, like, foreign correspondents, if you want to call it that, and she got paid, and she's the one who took the initiative to go to him and you know, present the idea to him, and then, you know, he agreed, and so she got paid. And when I thought about that, I'm like, that is savvy. That is business savvy. So those are just a few examples that I didn't think about it only from her writing standpoint, but from the business savvy aspect of it.
You know, that is such an unexpected kind of response to that question. From everything I thought about going into this interview, I would have never thought to think about it from that perspective. And I think it's so important and necessary. And I think needs to be amplified in very particular ways, because we're in the midst of all of these academic movements about cite Black women, pay Black women, and acknowledge our labor and our right to live. And we are then tasked with the advocacy and self-efficacy work of demanding what we deserve, if not more. And I think it is important to be able to call back to that legacy and that tradition, where all the different forms of work and labor she did, not just writing, all were part of not just this mission-driven passion that she had, yes, but also something that she could be paid for, so that she could live to keep doing the work and whatever else she liked, you know, so that she can give to the world, but to do so not at her own detriment when it came to being able to have a livelihood. And I think that is so urgent and so important as we get into all these conversations about how much do we want to pay workers, what is the minimum wage, what work is valued, whose labor is valued. For you to pinpoint that and say that tells me something about who she was, that's powerful, and I thank you for that.
All right, thank you.
And Ashley,
the other thing I would just want to quickly add, as far as her sort of self-determination and her putting a value on herself. And that's kind of what has inspired me, because like you said, we do live in a world where, in some situations we're constantly looking for sort of outside validation, and other people to decide how much we're worth. And so when I really started thinking through, in sort of a different way, some of the things that she was doing, that's what inspired me. I was like, she decided what she was worth, and she decided to advocate for herself what she was worth. And so that is what has resonated with me. And she believed in herself. She believed in her work enough to fight for it, in a financial way. And even today, I mean, 2021, I have personally, and I know a whole lot of people have, it's probably a very common, experience to have people love your work, but then they, want to try to figure out ways to not pay you. And so that's why I'm saying, for me, out of all of the things, all the achievements that my great grandmother did, which are all inspiring and phenomenal, her advocating for herself is what has inspired me. Like, it's been a voice in my head, like, you know what, you need to put your own value on yourself. And I think that's important for women in particular.
So putting value on ourselves and adding the tax, right? To it as well, because I mean, and I think, as you mentioned in the book and you talked about earlier, just, there were so few women doing this work. When they were in these narrow topics, right, that had nothing to do with social issues. So she's doing a lot of revolutionary work and demanding what she's worth in the process, which I think is great to know. And thank you for that perspective, because I think so often the message to many marginalized people, but especially Black women, is to just settle for whatever you're given, right? Or just be happy that you're invited. And so clearly from her life, it's like, yeah, no, this is what I'm worth. And I'm demanding this. And so I think that's an important lesson, because for many reasons, but particularly for Black women, it is often that people will, love your work and not want to pay you, or not want to value or give you what you're worth. Or, you may feel like you're not worthy of asking for more, because we're often asked to shrink ourselves in many ways. And so I really appreciate that response and that lesson. Brittany, I don't know if you wanted to add something else as well. No, okay, that was.
No, I think you spot on. You got it. I mean, adding tax, I love it. I love it because it is so often the narratives about these very important figures in history becomes static, and it becomes flattened, and who they are and what we can learn from them becomes a single narrative. And this is just so important and so fresh, and for in a book that is written in a way that so many people can access it, language accessibly written. Me and Ashley were just talking about, talking to her niece, 11 years old, and going over this book and talking about this, so accessible to have multiple touch points of what we can take away potentially is so valuable. And I think there's very different things that different communities can take away from it in different ways. And so, Ashley, you feel free, take it away.
Thank you. No, I mean, on top of just being visually compelling, on a side note, because I'm a visual person and my mother's a visual artist. So just the book itself, the cover's bad. The inside, I mean, there's just so much. But I think, in reading it, and because we're reading so much academic work as graduate students, I think just my niece, who's will be 11, she picked it up and said, "What's this?" And we had a whole conversation about Ida B. Wells's legacy. And my mother enjoys the book. And so we have 3 generations in our family who are enjoying this text, right? And extrapolating so much from it. And so you have outlined in the book and in this conversation so much that we can take from the life of your great grandmother. There's so much we can learn from her legacy, her writing, her business savvy. I mean, all these things that you are dropping. And so we can go on for days, but we know you have things to do, Miss Michelle. So the one thing I do want, as we're closing out, thinking about, her life and legacy, but this relationship between scholarship and activism, because she wrote about, what was happening at that time, and unfortunately it's still relevant today. She was writing about racism and social injustice, but also this activism, right? I mean, I think there are just so many examples of this in this book. And so from where you sit, what lessons do you think academia can take from the work of Ida B. Wells regarding that relationship between scholarship and activism?
Well, actually, one of the things that my great grandmother, one of the statements that she actually made in her autobiography, was how she was very deliberate in the Memphis Free Speech for to writing in ways that were accessible to the general public, who during the time, there was a high level of illiteracy rate, because we're talking about, fairly shortly after the Civil War, and African Americans who were enslaved, it was illegal for them to be educated, and so she had to find a way. She said she was deliberate and finding a way to use language. Vocabulary, when I say language, that was accessible to the masses of people who were not college educated, who were not professionals, and so, and even she, I mean, she unfortunately, her formal education was finished when she was only 16 years old, because both of her parents died during a yellow fever epidemic, and so she dropped out of school to take care of her 5 younger siblings. Things were a lot different in 1878 than they are today, and so she was able to get a job as a teacher by passing a teaching exam, because she was formally educated up to that point, so she was qualified to teach. But I mean, she really made it clear through the writings that she did, that she left behind for me to read through, that her goal was to appeal to the sort of the masses, and she lived during a very interesting time, because she was born during slavery, and she was born enslaved in the South, in Mississippi specifically, and so she was among the first generation of African Americans who were formerly enslaved to even have the opportunity to become formally educated. But then at the same time, you had some people who were born free in the North, like Du Bois, who had the opportunity to become educated all the way to a PhD, at Harvard University. And so in that one generation, you had this sort of differing amounts of opportunity. And there started to be sort of a more distinct educated class of African Americans. And I really think that was among the first generation where that was happening. And my great grandmother did have a little bit of clashes with certain people who she felt were, focused on more sort of academic approaches or analysis of issues that she saw front and center in her face. And she was like, we can't just talk about this, we actually need to do something. And so, some of the people, her contemporaries, who were, had a different sort of ideas about how to do things, were more focused on, let's talk about this problem, let's figure out what's going on, let's have a conference and have discussions about this and analyze it. And she just didn't have very much patience for that. And not that there's anything wrong with it, but just where her head was, she was in a different place than some of her contemporaries. And for that reason, and this is one of the things you asked earlier about, teaching history or curriculum, or how do we let people know about this information, I think it's very important for people to know the whole story, not just of my great grandmother, but about the Black community and about the Black experience, because we are not a monolith. Every single Black person doesn't have the same experience or have the same outlook or have the same ideas. And that was true during her time. People had different ideas on how to solve the race problem. And some of her contemporaries considered her to be radical and militant and, just outspoken and outrageous. I mean, they had major problems with her. and found her to be extremely difficult and intolerable. I mean, so today we're romanticizing her, like she's this shero, she was a bad woman, she did this, she did that. And it's like, yes, she did all those things. But a lot of people really did not like her. And some of the things that people said about her during her time are some of the same things that are said about women today. So being an outspoken woman with very strong ideas and, a personality that's a doer, where you kind of no nonsense kind of person and like, I don't really care if I've hurt your feelings because this is a life and death situation, are viewed in certain ways. And she did not care. She did not care enough to stop being that way. I mean, she did care, but not enough to be silenced. So she was all about activism. She was a very in your face, confrontational kind of person and not sugarcoating issues kind of person. She clearly did not care. She wasn't even trying to think about other people's feelings because she was like, you can just be mad because I'm going to tell the truth and you'll just have to figure out how to not be mad. And even if you're mad, I don't care, because she obviously felt that the issues that she was working on were so important. They were literally life and death situations. And so she wasn't interested in having teas and, kind of social issues, socialite kind of, ways of sort of celebrating themselves, but just focused on sort of uplifting the whole race. Just to conclude, because I could probably go on forever, but I mean, there were class differences then, just like there are now, and some people did not really cross class divides. There was an elite class in even back, in those times, and my great grandmother. One of the things I always have, as I've analyzed, put things in my own head of how I feel like she sort of navigated the world, was she transcended class when it came to who she interacted with. And that was very clear when it came to the Negro Fellowship League, that she was very willing to go into the alleys and talk to people who were gambling and, dealing with alcoholism. And there were some of her contemporaries who were definitely not willing to do that. They were more the people that will just like look at a study and decide what those people need. But she was like, I'm going to talk to those people. I'm going to bring them into my house and give them a meal. And that's where the difference was between the scholarship and the activism during her time.
Wow. Okay. that you laying it down, Michelle, you laying it down for us today, giving us a word. No, I think, and even as I've read the book and heard, I think this has given so much more insight, right, on, because then if there isn't that, I just think to myself, if there isn't that relationship between the scholarship and the activism, then what are we doing the scholarship for, right? If we're not actively working to try to change what we're studying, right? These inequalities we see, then why are we even doing it? So I sincerely appreciate that response. Brittany, did you have anything you wanted to ask or add? Because that was,
yes,
wow.
That was important. And I think there's a lot of people who need to hear that. And I know, Ashley, you just said, if we don't have the activism component, what are we doing it for? And I would just add, who are we doing it for? It's a lot of folks, I think, to your point, Michelle, who will write about communities that they've never stepped foot into, that when they do step foot into there, they're afraid. They're afraid and don't want nobody to talk to them. They want to go there with their notebook, take a couple pictures, and get on out. And I'm from Cabrini Green, and so I've lived it. I've seen it, in my neighborhood in Chicago. I've seen the gentrification happen. I've watched it, and I've been a part of it. And I think it's so important to figure out, to take to task the way scholarship happens. Here we are in 2021, and we are doing so much reclamation work of all of the ways that Ida B. Wells did scholarship in untraditional ways. She was not up at Harvard, hanging out with Du Bois, but she was doing critical and radical scholarship that we now in academia are saying, oh yes, let's look at that. That was valid and legit. And she never needed our validation because she was doing the work and she knew it was valid. And I think that it is important that we don't just celebrate that legacy as a thing of the past, but we carry it with us and translate it into our work and into our mission. When we go out and we call ourselves educators, scholars, activists, we have to be very intentional about what that means and who that is for, and where we situate our own ego into it. Because again, even if she was getting paid, even if she was doing all of this work through so many ways, she served a mission bigger than herself, and put real people first, and not a clean cookie cutter image of who Black people were to preserve particular ideologies and whatnot. She said their humanity mattered in all the ways they showed up as people. And I think we get in these ivory towers. We forget to go home and visit our folks, and walk through our neighborhoods, and we get very comfortable. And the work of being with people and serving people is often not very comfortable at all, especially when we are dismantling systems of inequality. And I think there's so much that we need to keep with us that she lived and did, including the necessary critique and call out of her contemporaries and her peers, and other people who were working in different ways that still mattered. And I think it's important to continue having those conversations, even as they're tough and uncomfortable, because the people we are trying to support and serve often aren't comfortable as they're navigating these systems of inequality that one small degree off our plate, we will be walking through. And even with the degrees and whatnot, we still face every day. There's just so much. There's so much.
Well, yeah, I mean, I work in academia, so I know some of the dynamics, that are involved in publishing and all of that, and and so one of the things that I hope that people take from the book, Ida B. the Queen, and also just my great grandmother's life is just the idea that that we all are part of this huge community, and everybody plays an important role, and there are various ways to deal with the same issue, and I just think that there needs to be a little bit more equity when it comes to listening to certain people, especially listening to them about their own situations, because I think sometimes there's this dynamic of, well, I know what's better for you. I know what's better for you. Then you know what's better for yourself. And so when it comes to, like I said, scholarship, and I've been in these spaces where, there's study of a lot of, statistics and trends and, all of these kind of things, which are very important to know, but you actually need to meet the people that are actually being studied, or meet people who are being affected by whatever the policies are that are being studied, and listen to those people who are in the spaces that are being affected or that are being studied. I'll give one example. When I was in college, I went to Ivy League school on the East Coast, and one of my the guy that was living in my dorm was studying, he was still studying an education class, and he was studying the Chicago Public Schools in his class. And I'm from Chicago, and I went to Chicago Public Schools, but he was going to tell me what the Chicago Public Schools were like. And I'm like, first of all, have you ever been to Chicago? No. Have you ever been to Chicago Public School? No. Have you ever met anybody who went to Chicago Public School? No. But he's going to tell me. He's the expert because he read a book. And that was my first experience with the sort of major disconnect, between, people who want to consider themselves experts on something, but they've never even met anybody or even been in that environment. So I just think there needs to be a bridge. And I think there needs to be, maybe that's part of the whole scholarship aspect, is to not only study a problem, but meet the people.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. To meet the people. It's good. We still see that happening, right? As folks do research, right? And really not having an intimate knowledge of the folks, or problematizing the people, right? In their research and in their work, and claiming themselves to be experts. And so I think that's such a critical point with your own work, as well as with the work that your great grandmother did. So there was so much in this conversation, Michelle, and wow. Like it's rare that I'm speechless. I'm speechless. There's so much that you shared that's inspiring on a personal and an academic level for us, myself and Brittany, as well as everybody who I know is going to be listening into this. And so thank you for making time. We know you have a very busy schedule, in the midst of everything going on, but thank you for this very important conversation about the legacy of your great grandmother, about your work. And we just appreciate you being here and doing this for us and for Triple SP. So thank you once again.
Well, thank you, Ashley and Brittany, for this opportunity. And hopefully, something that I've said will resonate with people.
It will. It will. It definitely will. Oh, awesome. Thank you so much.